welcome everybody. Thank you for coming to our second in the Great Decisions lecture series, co-sponsored by St. Norbert College and the University of Wisconsin, Green Bay. My name is David Corey, and I'm the coordinator from the UW Green Bay side, and I'd like to thank Bev Moser and Father Anwu from St. Norbert College, who together with me helped to coordinate and organize the series. Just as a word for those maybe joining us for the first time, to let you know that the next lecture will be on Wednesday, March 5th at 6:30 p.m. In person at St. Norbert campus in the Fort Howard Theater. And my colleague from UW Green Bay, Dr. Paul Bellinger, will be speaking on AI and American national security. So that promises to be another interesting lecture. So mark your calendars for that on May 5th. In person at St. Norbert College. Tonight's talk on the United States and China allows us to welcome back Dr. Joe Dennis from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Professor Dennis is a scholar of early modern China and teaches both pre-modern and modern Chinese history at UW-Madison. His areas of interest include Chinese social, economic, legal, and cultural history. He is a past president of the Society for Ming Studies and has published widely on imperial China, including a book with Harvard University Press entitled Writing, Publishing, and Reading Local Gazetteers in Imperial China from 1100 to 1700. He's the recipient of multiple awards and teaches regularly on Chinese history. So we're very grateful and fortunate to have him here with us tonight to speak about US-China relations. Professor Dennis will be speaking for about 40 minutes, and then afterwards I'll be moderating a discussion. So I would like to ask the audience, those of you who are joining us, any questions you have, please put them in the Q&A. Don't use the chat if you would, but rather the Q&A. And then at the end, I can go through and moderate those questions. So at any time during the presentation, please type in the Q&A, and at the end, I'll ask the questions and can moderate for them. So without further ado, then I'll turn it over to you, Dr. Dennis. Thank you and welcome.
Thank you, David, and thank you to St. Norbert College, to UW Green Bay. It's very kind of you to invite me to give this lecture. I'm really looking forward to having a chance to talk to everybody about China. I've been working and studying about China for a long time and have a lot I could say. So I'm going to make a presentation for about 35 minutes, and then I hope we have plenty of time for questions and answers. So let me just start by going through the document that people were given as part of the talk preparation. This is Professor Christensen's article, and one of the things that this article does, it really takes an international relations and political science approach to dealing with US-China relations. So today what I'd like to do is go deeper into the historical context of US-China relations, and then I'd like to wrap up by giving my own thoughts about US-China relations and what should be done in this regard. So Professor Christensen went through several big points. He said that US-China relations have been in a downward spiral since 2008, and that this has been accelerating since 2012. That's when Xi Jinping came to power. He also made the point that China has been much more assertive in the last years in ways that have upset people in the United States government. First of all, there's been territorial aggression, expansion into the South Sea, despite a ruling from the United Nations that they do not own all of the South China Sea. They've been threatening Taiwan. And this has really led to various responses from the United States, more selling of weapons to Taiwan, more political support for Taiwan in the U.S. In addition, the Chinese military has been growing quickly. It's expanding its capabilities, its technological capacity, and just the number of ships, planes, etc. that it has. Another thing that has happened is that China has been trying to replace the United States as a center of the world order and make it more into a Chinese world order. They've been financing all kinds of projects in different parts of the world through the Belt and Road Initiative. They've started new investment banks. They've joined lots of different multilateral associations of various types. One other thing that has been causing upset in people in the US government is crackdowns on Hong Kong on democracy a few years ago, also on people who are not ethnically Chinese, such as the Uyghurs, Tibetans, and Mongols. The former Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, called it genocide, and this has framed a lot of US-China relations. One thing that's happened in the last years is that Americans from many different political points of view are increasingly viewing China as a strategic competitor. This was really not the case 25, 30 years ago. Some people were concerned at that point, but most people didn't take it as a very serious threat. Another of Christensen's points is that the long-term trade deficit with China is a problem. China has huge capacity in manufacturing, overcapacity, and is now dumping a lot of its products on the open market around the world. And this is really destabilizing to a lot of other countries. There's also residual anger from COVID in the United States as well as in China. This has really led to a disconnect among people in China and the US for several years. After the COVID first started, Donald Trump used racist language like Kung flu and China virus, and this was really not very helpful for US-China relations. In addition, the Chinese government tried to pin it on the Americans as the source of COVID, which of course was not true. A few other points that he made. In the first Trump administration, Donald Trump damaged US alliances, and that after Biden came into power, he increased domestic investment, rebuilt some of these alliances, and tried to enhance security cooperation in the Pacific. So in this chapter, Professor Christensen is really talking about how the administrations have changed. And this is one of the important points in understanding US-China relations is that Chinese leadership tends to change much less frequently than American leadership. We've gone through 4 different administrations in the last, we've had Obama, then we had Trump 1, and then we had Biden, then now we have Trump 2. A few other points that Professor Christensen made were that multilateral resistance to Russia's invasion of Ukraine has been very important to US credibility, and this is now in question. There's also been a reevaluation of Taiwan's position, and this is also a critical aspect of US-China relations. How does the US view Taiwan? How much is it going to support Taiwan militarily, economically? How does it view the right government of China? Is it still a one China policy? There's also in the last few years been a decoupling or at least a de-risking. These two terms are variants of the same thing. Decoupling is something that goes much farther. De-risking is decoupling in a smaller group of sectors. This is damaging to both the US and China in different ways, and we'll go into that a little bit more later. The final thing that Christensen says is that we need goals, not just raw competition, that the United States needs a strategy, some kind of goal to try to reach with China. Okay, so now I'd like to just talk about when I think about US-China relations, what are some key aspects? So just moving away from Professor Christensen's chapter, I'd like to talk first about some of my own views on this, and then the history of US-China relations, and then come back and give more thoughts on the current situation. So the first thing is that relations are really affected by strengths and weaknesses of the United States and China, and these are both real and imagined. It's very often that we think, China's doing this, China's doing that, One of the big ones that has been around for a long time is that if China wants to do something, it can do it easily. It can simply command that something be done. And sometimes that's true, but other times it's really not. And this is often also a weakness. Uh, Often they decide they're going to do something, everybody follows, and it turns out to be the wrong choice. So when you think about how relations are formed, a lot of it is by perceptions of the other side that sometimes are right and sometimes are not. So we shouldn't really be assuming strengths of China or weaknesses of China or the US. We really need to dig in, analyze them, and see how they've changed over time. It's also important to have a long perspective on this. The US and China have been interacting for almost 200 years, and what has happened in those 200 years has affected how we interact with China today. There's also very important recent things, short-term things that are important for understanding the current state of relationships. And then there's very recent new issues as well. So, try to keep in mind the big long-term picture, the medium term, and the short term. So next, I'd like to go through the history of U.S.-China relations. And I've just put up a list of things that I'm going to talk about, and I'm just going to go through these one by one because they're important in different ways. So the first thing is the opium trade. So if you go back to when the United States and China really started interacting, it's in the early 1800s, and the British start selling opium to China. The U.S. Started getting into it too. And eventually, about a third of the opium sales to China were by Americans. So it's not the US government directly, it's different people who went to Turkey, they bought opium and sold it in China. A few famous people, for example, the ancestors of John Kerry, the former senator, they sold opium in China, and that was one of the sources of wealth. Uh, Recently, we have the kind of the karma has come back, and China has been selling fentanyl to uh, people who are, or at least the chemicals that are being made into fentanyl that's being sold in the U.S. and is a big part of the um, opium epidemic, overdoses, deaths from very potent fentanyl. And so this is a chart from the DEA. It's uh, it's become a big issue. We saw this recently with President Trump. He threatened to put um, tariffs on Canada and Mexico, in part, or at least with the assertion that it was about restraining immigration and fentanyl sales. So, how much, if that's the real reason, that's kind of another question. But uh, the point I'm trying to make here is that if we just go back to this, there's been a love-hate relationship for almost 200 years. There's things that both sides have done that are very difficult for the other side to accept, and there's things that they have liked, people have liked about the other country and the people of the other country. So let's just go forward in time. Some other things that were important. A lot of trade developed in China with Americans in the early 1800s besides opium. They bought tea. They exchanged it for, before the opium trade, for beaver pelts, tools, mirrors, cloths, other kinds of stuff. And then you get this big event, the Opium Wars. So the Chinese government decided they could not tolerate the sale of opium anymore by the British mainly and the Americans. And so there's a war that goes on from 1839 to 1842, and it's concluded with the Treaty of Nanjing. And here's a painting of that event. And this treaty really sets the terms for relations between Britain and China, but for all the Western countries, they build on this very quickly with other treaties that give them the same rights as the British. So in this treaty, the Qing dynasty, the last imperial dynasty of China, they ceded Hong Kong Island to the British, and ultimately this went back in 1997. They also had to pay a lot of money. It used to be a loser pays system in wars. There was an end of the monopoly on trade that was called the Kohong, and instead there was a new system of fixed tariffs. Also, there were consular offices opened for the first time. This was not previously allowed by the Qing government. And there was extraterritoriality. And I'll talk about this more in just a minute. Two other important clauses were that there would be most favored nation status for other groups. So if the Japanese got a good deal, then the British would get that deal. So this has the effect of ratcheting down the amount of control the Qing dynasty had over its trade. Of course, when you get into the modern era, then the WTO does the same kind of thing. Most favored nation has that effect of making tariffs lower and lower. The final thing was that treaty ports were opened. So Shanghai, Ningbo, Xiamen, Fuzhou, and Guangzhou are opened in this first treaty. So Shanghai then quickly becomes a major port. It already existed as a port, but it really booms as foreigners come in and for various other reasons. During this period, there's a lot of conflict between foreigners and Chinese over law. The Qing Dynasty Code was very different from the Western legal systems, either the British or the continental systems. There's no presumption of innocence. There's very few rights for the accused, severe bodily punishments, and negligence was also punished criminally. So this led to various kinds of conflict. So when I mentioned extraterritoriality just a minute ago, one of the things that happened then is by different treaties, different Western countries got extraterritorial rights, including the United States. So this starts in 1845, and pretty soon they're trying criminal cases of their own citizens that happen in China in their own consulates. Ultimately, this becomes the U.S. District Court for China. So in this image, you can see the volume of extraterritorial cases that was compiled by the judge, Charles Lobingier, who was the judge of the U.S. District Court for China. And you can see down at the bottom, this was printed in Manila. So Manila had become a U.S. colony or territory by this time after the Spanish-American War. And so that becomes a big American base. So this becomes representative of imperialism, that the U.S. is asserting rights that interfere with Chinese sovereignty. And this really shapes things down to the present. In China, one of the main sources of legitimacy for the Communist Party, it's no longer communism. Most people don't really believe in communism, including the communists. It's really nationalism. So they push the idea of a strong China that can take its rightful place in the world. And this has been going on for decades. So one of the reasons it resonates with Chinese people is they keep alive this history that goes back into the 1800s about when China was really abused by Western powers. At the same time, when you get people coming into these treaty ports to Shanghai and then eventually to Beijing and other cities, there's also a lot of things that Westerners brought, including Americans, that were quite popular in China. So there's both conflict and cooperation. Missionaries in China, they built schools, they built hospitals, churches, but they also proselytized, they got in various kinds of disputes with people. So it's a mixed blessing, but certainly a lot of people in China were very welcoming to some of the things that came from these Western missionaries. For example, here we have St. John's University in Shanghai, one of the early modern colleges in China, Peking Medical Union College. This is a place I was treated when I lived in Beijing in the early 1990s. It's still a very famous hospital. After the collapse of the Qing and through World War II, there's a growth in trade. There's breaks during the Depression, but there's all kinds of different connections are made by American corporations, and they start selling things in China and vice versa. So this trade continues to develop during World War II, but then you get the Chinese Civil War in the 1930s and 40s that ultimately in 1949, the communists win. So they defeat the Nationalist Party, the Nationalist Fleet of Taiwan, and uh, there's still the split down to today that is affecting US-China relations. Going back to the late Qing, there's a few other things that I want to mention. So in 1900, there's the Boxer Rebellion. This is when the Boxers were a group that organized and attacked foreigners. They saw foreigners as being a major problem, and there's a suppression of this. First, the Qing government supports them, but then there's an allied army consisting of British, Russian, German, Japanese, American, Italian troops come in. So here you can see the American train coming from the coast at Tianjin and then entering Beijing with troops. And once this army gets into Beijing, then they execute lots of the Boxers, and there's another humiliating treaty that's signed. So there's something called the Boxer Indemnity. And the Boxer Indemnity was money that had to be paid for losses caused to the foreigners. And as part of this, the Americans, they didn't actually use, there wasn't that many damages. And so some of this money ended up going into a program that brought Chinese to American universities. So in the early 1900s, you get lots of Chinese students start coming to the United States. And I put UW-Madison where I work. It had 95 of these Boxer Indemnity scholarship students in the early 1900s. They also had lots of other students start coming shortly thereafter, students that were supported by different ministries, by provincial governments, and pretty soon the number grew to be quite a bit. So in 1907, you get the first Chinese coming to the university. They form clubs, they start getting degrees, and some of them start going back to China and working, and they become very influential in the government. Uh, Also in many industries. UW grads and grads from other colleges in the United States take on important roles in the new nationalist administration. So the reason I'm showing you this is we're talking about US-China relations. I want you to remember that don't only think of it as being government to government um, connections or policies. It's not just is Donald Trump raising the tariffs? It's not just is Xi Jinping going to attack Taiwan? There's lots of exchanges between people at the people to people level. And so this has been going on for a very long time, from the missionaries connecting to people in China to Chinese students coming to the United States in the early 1900s. So I pulled out these two newspaper articles, Chinese students at the university. And on the one on the left, it says, it appears that the Badger Institution was recommended to Chinese students as the best school for them in this country by no less an authority than Minister Wu Ting-feng at Washington. So Wu Ting-feng was the first Chinese minister to the United States. So this comes right at the end of the Qing dynasty, which collapsed in 1911. On the right, it says there are now 40 Chinese students enrolled at the state university. They constitute the largest delegation at Madison representing any foreign country. So if you think about the interactions between students, they've really been going on for a long time. And lots of Americans know Chinese who have come here as students, and these connections have persisted for at least a century. In the 1930s and into the 40s, you continue to have lots of students coming to Wisconsin. And these connections then broke off during the Chinese Civil War, except for students from Taiwan came. So now let me go back to another, switching from Chinese students. let me talk about the Chinese Exclusion Act. This is also very important for understanding U.S.-China relations. The United States government banned Chinese in large part for many years. Starting in 1882, this is the first group of people who are excluded as a group from coming to the United States. And this Chinese Exclusion Act, it's replaced with subsequent acts, but really up until 1965, only a very small number of people were allowed to immigrate to the United States from China. And you think, well, okay, why does this matter? Well, people know this, and this caused a lot of bad feeling towards the United States. These kinds of, first we had the extraterritorial laws that went the unequal treaties that went from 1842 up until 1943. This is called the century of humiliation. So this century of humiliation notion is something that really resonates with people down to the present. It's something it's a phrase that's still used. You see it in the Chinese media all the time. But things have gone back and forth. In various periods, the United States was allied very closely with China. So, for example, in World War I and World War II, China fought with the Allies. After the end of World War II, the U.S. sent troops to China to assist the nationalist government in fighting the communists. Of course, the nationalists lost in 1949, and the nationalists fled to Taiwan, where they still maintained the Republic of China, which started in 1912. So it's still in existence on Taiwan. This is also a source of, actually, one of the biggest sources of difficulty in U.S.-China relations today is the status of Taiwan. It is the first, Taiwan is the first republic. It represents the inability of the mainland to finish the Civil War. And they blame the United States for that. At various points in time, the U.S. has stepped up to keep the mainland government from taking over in Taiwan. Of course, as we go forward in time, there are other difficult points. There's, of course, the Korean War in 1950, 51, 52, 53. There's very intense fighting. The Chinese come in on the side of the communists in North Korea. There's the split of the North and the South after World War II. And you get lots of propaganda like in this poster. So this says, "Long live the victory of the Korean People's Army and the Chinese People's Volunteer Army." Of course, it's not really volunteers. These were regular army troops, but they called it a volunteer army to soften the appearance of it. But you can see pointing to Douglas MacArthur cowering on the ground and running away with a tattered U.S. flag. So both sides, I would say, have lots of different propaganda. We had McCarthyism here, a famous Wisconsinite who in the 50s set off a purge in the government of people he imagined were communist supporters. So people in the State Department were attacked. People in various parts of the government were attacked. In China, you have a lot of people with foreign connections get attacked, especially in the 1960s and 70s. In 1972, Nixon went to China, and then the United States recognized the People's Republic in 1979. So this is a switch of recognition from the nationalist-run Republic of China to the People's Republic. And as part of this, there's a reaction in Congress. There's also something called the Taiwan Relations Act, which says that the U.S. will continue to support Taiwan, even though it's recognizing one China and that the People's Republic is the real China. After Mao died in 1976, then you get a modernization of China in many different ways. There's a program called the Four Modernizations. They promote improvements in agriculture, industry, defense, science, and technology. And so Deng Xiaoping, whose photo is in the upper right of the screen, He's famous for saying, it doesn't matter if a cat is black or white. If it catches mice, it's a good cat. So this poster that you see, it's the black and white cat. So that the point here is that uh, it's a repudiation of idea that's come to be characterized as better read than expert, which means ideology is more important than expertise. And you see echoes of this in various governments. You might sense this in our current situation. Anyways, after opening and reform gets going, you get all kinds of opening up to the world. So this is in 1979 and 80. The chancellor of the University of Wisconsin went to China. He had some old connections, an old roommate, and he set up a trip where he would arrange for Chinese scientists to come to Wisconsin. And so here's Chancellor Shane. He brought in a bunch of people, more than 450 people in the early 1980s. So this is when I was in high school, and I graduated in 1981, and I started seeing these Chinese scholars around Madison. And one of the things that I really admired about them was that they rode their bikes in the winter. Back at that time, you really didn't see people riding their bikes in Madison in winter, but they did. They were just used to it. So this starts the kind of the boom in U.S.-China educational exchange after several decades where the PRC was not sending students. In connection with this, you get the growth of Chinese language programs in the United States. More and more students start to study. Just talking from my own institution here, the UW Library begins in 1917. It's one of the bigger academic libraries with Chinese, maybe the top 15 or 16. And they start teaching Chinese at the university in 1950, and then you get this boom after 79. So this is a picture of my second year Chinese class. That's me, the third person from the right. And there's a guy in blue up there standing, the tall guy. He's the head of the East Asian Legal Studies Center at Madison. There's a lot of these people had careers in China. And this really comes about because of this opening and reform leads to more opportunities to study Chinese. So lots of people started going to China. So this is me in 1987 with my high school class. It's the Jiangxi School of Foreign Trade, and these students were all going. Instead of going to a regular academic high school, they were learning how to do letters of credit, bills of lading, how to move money around, this kind of stuff, things that you have to do in international trade. So lots and lots of these technical institutes were built and exchanges were held with Americans. Today, there's still lots of people studying China and teaching about it, but some of what's happening now is that the economy is a little bit down in China, so people are not quite as able to send their kids to study abroad. It's about 3 times the price to come to the University of Wisconsin as a foreign student compared to a Wisconsin student. And also, people are not really sure if it's a good idea anymore. So there is some decline, but we still had about 250 new students from China at Madison this year. Okay, so let's go back to some of the problems for China. One, after 1978, they really didn't have access to the sort of non-communist technology, and they had to do a lot of negotiating. They didn't have good technical support, and so they start building up a lot of technical institutions and reaching out to the West. They restructured the economy. They started new kinds of enterprises that reinvested a lot of profits from exports. So the industrialization really takes off starting in the 80s. There's things before then, of course, but the connections to international markets is a product of the 1980s in large part. So rapid modernization comes. and people become extremely entrepreneurial. So all kinds of energy is let loose in the 1980s and 90s in China. So this gets us up to the next thing I want to talk about. So that was kind of the historical background. I want to go quickly through China and the WTO. The reason for this is that the World Trade Organization is something that really made China's rise possible. Before this time, it was outside of the world trading system, and then ultimately in 2001, it becomes a member. And this makes it possible for it to sell all kinds of stuff to the rest of the world. So uh, let's skip the early part of the GATT. But in 1982, the People's Republic tried to join, but it didn't happen. Uh, they asked to join in 1986, and you start getting negotiations. But then the GATT was dissolved, and eventually the World Trade Organization replaced it. While that was happening, you get a democracy movement in China. And starting in 1978, you get people advocating for democracy. And this goes really through the 1980s. Unfortunately, in 1989, there's a big crackdown on democracy advocates, and there's a big massacre in Beijing. So China's international relations were poor for a bit, but then uh, things kind of turned around, and President Clinton starts negotiating, and ultimately China gets in 2001 to the WTO. While it was happening, China had a lot of concerns. One was that their own industries would be overwhelmed by advanced industries elsewhere, that their own agriculture would be wiped out by foreign agriculture, and that they'd lose their sovereignty to foreign countries again. But they also hoped that it would improve the overall economic situation in China. Abroad, people were worried that China wouldn't comply with its commitments, that cheap labor would wipe out labor-intensive industries, that poor environmental standards would attract industries from the developed countries to China. But they also thought that they could make more money by using China's cheap labor, its big market, and etc. One of the big hopes was that this would cause China to be much more open and become a lot more like European or Americans, that it would just become another country in the international order. President Clinton talked a lot about this at the time. In March 2000, he said, uh, China's not just agreeing to import more of our products, it's agreeing to import one of democracy's most cherished values, economic freedom. And um, I'm not going to go through all this, but anyways, he also said that China is going to eliminate tariffs on information technology, and this will make democracy spread. He said, we know how much the internet has changed America. We're already an open society. Imagine how much it could change China. Now, there's no question China is going to be able to crack down on the internet. Good luck with that. So, there's expectations formed by the negotiations around the WTO. A lot of Americans, I think myself included, we thought that this would really bring China into the world system as it already existed. But it's not really what happened. There were lots of things that China agreed to that it didn't really do. So, all kinds of government subsidies, lots of things that blocked US and other companies from being able to actually get a hold in China. It really became a problem. So let's just look at uh, the trend in trade. In 1978, China had about 1% of world trade. 1995, it had about 3%. By 2018, it was up to 13%, and now it's even more. So the problems um, were really that the United States did not insist on reciprocity or hold China to the rules that it had agreed to. China regularly rejected U.S. companies. For example, things that the U.S. was really good at, things like Google, Facebook, financial services, legal services, they were just blocked out of China. And lots of companies that invested in China had their intellectual property taken and then had um, Chinese companies develop and use it and export it at a lower price. I would like to know how Elon Musk is feeling right now. He invested all this money in China in electric vehicles and now electric vehicle production, in part, I would assume, by using technology learned through the Tesla factories, are spreading around the world. So that gets us up to the more recent times. Donald Trump has been very interested in changing the relationship with China, both in economic and security terms. He's been very critical. He's brought in a group of people that would like to raise tariffs and really try to contain China economically, such as Peter Navarro and others. I think the WTO seems essentially dead to me. I don't see it as having the same role that it had a couple decades ago, that something new is going to have to come out in the next few years. So what should we do going forward? I know we're running short on time, so let me just kind of go quickly. Things that I think need to be done. We need to be honest in evaluating American and Chinese strengths and weaknesses, not blow things out of proportion, and definitely don't shoot ourselves in the foot. Don't make hostility the default. I think it's a bad idea to just be reflexively hostile to other people. But it's also important to be firm where it's justified or important. We also need to acknowledge the substantial benefits to Americans that engagement with China brings. Uh, I could go into these at great length. Maybe if you have questions about it, I'd be happy to answer them in the Q&A. The other thing I think we need to do is acknowledge the benefits that the U.S. gets from being central to the world financial, trade, and military orders, keeping the U.S. dollar as the world's most important currency. That's that's something that I'm not sure the current administration accepts or recognizes, but that doesn't mean it's not the fact. I think if we switched over to the euro or to the Chinese renminbi, it would severely damage the United States. Uh, we also need to acknowledge that if you look at the long scope of history, American strength is enhanced by welcoming immigrants and making an attractive place for both high skill and low skill workers to work. I think it's really important that we put our own house in order and that doing this would go a long ways towards solving problems with China. American politics have really been consumed by domestic issues for several decades that really undermine our competitiveness and don't do anything to solve some of the problems that I just talked about. A lot of our representatives have not been serious about government and have not been willing to place national interests ahead of personal interests or party interests. I think it's also critical for Americans to understand the historical sources of wealth and power, and they should not be just giving them away. I think we need to look at what happened in Brexit. I think it's very uh, illustrative of what happens when you disengage from a system that you were deeply embedded in. We also need to give up a lot of short-term thinking that's driven by election cycles and party politics. And we also need to learn more about China. One of the things that's always struck me and frustrated me is how many people in China know about the United States. A lot of people don't know much, but there are millions and millions of people who have a very deep understanding of the US. Whereas in the United States, how many people really know much about China? It's not many. And I think we also need to think hard about what private companies are doing and are they really in the national interest at all times? One of the tensions in US China relations is the role of companies in making policy. And we need to have a hard look at that. We also need to give up on this idea of American exceptionalism. It's it's not helpful to how we interact with other people, and it's not based in reality the way that it's used politically. Uh, maybe we should stop here and have discussion because we only have about 15 minutes left. So let me turn it back over to David, and I'd be happy to take questions.
Excellent. Thank you. Fascinating talk, and we've got some questions already here in the Q&A. Anybody else that you have questions, please type them in to the Q&A, and we'll get to as many of them as we can. One of the first questions that came in had to do with Taiwan and political issues there. Do you think that there will be a Taiwan Strait war with China involving Taiwan around 2027? What would any likely outcome of such a conflict be?
I think it's something that we should do everything we can to avoid. I think some of this really depends on what the United States does in general. If the administration moves us into an isolationist policy, I think it makes it a lot more likely that China would think it can attack Taiwan and get some kind of benefit out of it. Right now, China, it makes so much money in the United States market, it would be a disaster to their economy to completely break off economic relations. So I think to the extent that we have deep economic relations, it becomes very difficult for China to attack Taiwan. So I'm not, I hate to predict because I think we're in a very unpredictable period. Things that a lot of people have taken for granted for many years are being turned over very quickly in the new administration, and we just don't know exactly where they're going. But I think it's, what's happening with Russia and the Ukraine is really very damaging. That you have the Trump administration essentially surrendering to Vladimir Putin in Ukraine, and this sends a message. In the first administration, this is part of it. Trump. Trump is he ran on being an isolationist. He he got a treaty with the Taliban. He made an agreement that the United States would pull out of Afghanistan, and then President Biden did it. And this creates the view in many parts of the world that the U.S. is a paper tiger. So I don't want to predict what's going to happen. It's hard to know who's going to win out these battles within the U.S. government. Um, it's kind of a funny thing. President Trump has been going in several different directions that are contradictory. He's been saying we're going to take the Panama Canal, we're going to take Greenland, we want Canada to become the 51st state, which is a very expansive imperialist kind of rhetoric. But at the same time, he's saying, well, we're not going to get in other people's business. We're going to get out of a lot of these things that we're really involved in. We're going to pull out of the World Health Organization. We're going to stop doing foreign aid. So I see these as being two very contradictory things. One is promoting a kind of American power, and the other is withdrawing from it. So I have no prediction for 2027.
Yeah, that is certainly a tough one there. As you say, the very unpredictable um, times in the US. We have a couple questions dealing with technology. One of them that I was also thinking of as well, that, as you know, has been quite a bit in the news, the conflict with TikTok and the ban over that, and this suggestion that this was somehow being used as a means for the Chinese government to gather data and information. And ironically, President Trump was in favor of it, and then he was against it, and keeps quiet and is temporarily suspended, I believe, but it still potentially is set to go into effect. But any thoughts about TikTok and that controversy?
Well, I think there's a lot of Chinese apps that people can have their data collected from. I think a lot of apps are collecting data. It's hard to avoid having big corporations know about you, that your own government, other governments, they all know about you. And I'm a little skeptical of the idea that somebody is going to be extorted when they're an adult in the State Department because they posted some dance video. If we've learned anything from the Trump administration is you can be a felon, you can say really things that would have gotten you disqualified from running for even mayor or city councilman 20 years ago don't disqualify you from being president anymore. So I'm a little skeptical of the argument that TikTok would bring around the downfall of the American security apparatus. But that being said, I'm not, one of the things I mentioned a little earlier was that China has banned US technology companies for many, many years. New York Times, Washington Post, Facebook, Google, lots of others are just not allowed to operate in China. And on that basis, I would say, well, reciprocity is important in trade. And if the US government wanted to say, we're going to ban all your technology companies for that reason, I'm not sure that I would object. But I'm a little skeptical of um, the TikTok national security argument. Now, some other kind of technologies, maybe I would be a little bit concerned about. I think that all major governments, militaries are trying to get access to people's power grids, to key institutions, and it some applications can be vehicles for getting inside critical infrastructure. But I'm not sure that TikTok is really that.
Someone else, staying on the topic of technology, someone else had a question about seek, the an AI, and in more general, how far the tech gap is between the US and China. And particularly with DeepSeek, I might point out for those who joined us a little late that the next Great Decisions topic will actually be about AI and American security. So we can talk a little bit more about that. But your thoughts certainly about this technology gap between US and China. I know China, as you mentioned, has been putting a lot of money investing in it, having a lot of students study to learn a lot about programming and technology to bring it back to strengthen their tech sector.
I think one of the things you always have to keep in mind when you're trying to understand China is China has 4 times the population as the US. We think of the US as being number one in many ways. This is part of what I was saying about American exceptionalism. And in some ways, the US is extremely advanced, but we're still a quarter of the size uh, of China. And they've been investing a lot of money in technological universities and in companies. And I work on a project. I'm doing a digital humanities project with some Taiwanese computer scientists at a German research institute, and so we meet a lot of Chinese scientists, and they're very there's a very deep bench, and I think a lot of Americans they say, well, we invent stuff here, but then maybe that's not enough. Well, I think China has become very good with their manufacturing processes, but also with computer technology. If you have a lot of people working at a lower price, you can put a lot of people on a project. And so some of the projects I've been involved with that are really about history research have involved a whole bunch of computer science students in China working for very little money. And so when the thing about DeepSeek the other, recently, well, there's these billions and billions of dollars being sunk into AI in the US. Sometimes we do it a fairly expensive way. And I think things, uh, across the economy in China, there are lower input costs, and that's a big advantage. The labor advantage is going to change over time. The one-child policy has caused coming wave of demographic collapse, but that may also spur some kind of um, new technological development to deal with that. I think you see that in Japan. They have a declining population, and so there's more use of robots, different, self-driving vehicles might become big for elderly people when they can't drive. So, I mean, there's things that happen as a result of that. But I think that, you don't want to underestimate Chinese scientific capacity. They have spent a lot of, they invest heavily in science and schools. They
You
also
know,
track, sorry.
no, I was just going to say I was actually going to ask something. You brought up the one child policy and this demographic looming issue that they have in China, and you know, how do you see in many European countries, they have a similar problem in that they have an aging population, low birth rate, and there's really only, two possibilities. Either people start having more children or immigration. And when you talked about some of the conflicts of the ethnic minorities, China, correct me if I'm wrong, hasn't been particularly open to incoming immigration. So, I mean, what are their
I,
thoughts? I
I
mean,
think this is a big issue in a lot of places, but China, Japan, Korea, very low birth rates and are anti-immigrant. So, historically, the U.S. has been more welcoming to immigrants. Germany took a bunch of immigrants at a few different points. Uh, it's it's a way to revitalize your country and to support your labor force. I mean, I teach ancient China as well, and one of the things I always have people read is the discussions of, how do you win during the warring states period? How do you get your little state to defeat all the other states? Well, the main thing is you become a moral leader who attracts people to your state because people are the source of strength. And I wish that all Americans would read some of the ancient Chinese classics on immigration because I think we forget that many think of the costs of food are going to go skyrocketing if we got rid of all the immigrants. Here we are in Wisconsin. Who's going to milk the cows? A lot of these people are not going to be milking anymore if they're kept out at the border. And this will be a real shock to a lot of people. But it's a danger to our national strength because our birth rate has also dropped below the replacement level. Uh, if you want to have Social Security when you are 67 or 70 or whatever the retirement age is by the time you hit it, uh, you want to have a workforce that is big enough to actually make the payments. So I find it infuriating the kind of rhetoric that you see coming out of the government that has uh, really just attacked immigrants and not recognized how important they are to our economy and our national strength.
yeah, absolutely. Well, fascinating as well when you talked about um, wishing that Americans could read some of these ancient Chinese texts about immigration, but you were also talking about this battle for supremacy. Somebody asked that very question, that is the race to be number one in world power something that can end in a tie? Can the US and China basically share the role of being the most influential economic empires in the world? Or will the country at the top inevitably hold all the cards and have everything else everybody else wants? And maybe what do the ancient Chinese texts tell us about this question?
Well, a lot of these texts were written in the context of the Warring States period when there was this intense competition to try to unify all of the states. Uh, but I think it is possible for people to get along in a competitive system if people recognize the legitimate interests of other people and can relax enough to not struggle to dominate other people. I think it's very hard if you get the perception that you're way behind and in danger. And I think this is how a lot of people in China felt for a long time, that they were bullied by Western countries in this century of humiliation because they didn't have the technology and the management skills and other things that Western countries had, and this made their lives very dangerous. But the problem is if you go too far with that in building up national strength, then you're going to make other people feel afraid, and then it becomes a cycle where nobody can win. So I think you need to the goal should be some kind of balance where people can not be afraid for themselves or their country, but also not feel the need that they have to dominate and destroy other people.
And that ties into one more question that maybe we can close out since we're here right at 7:30. Someone wrote that after studying about and traveling in China for some 40 years, in their opinion, they believe that the long-term strategy is still to dominate and not to coexist in world markets, and that they view the US as a major roadblock to conquer. And they simply plan to do this economically and through technology. And they were asking your thoughts about that sort of position.
Well, I think what I would say to that is that there's 1.4 billion people in China, and they all have different opinions. There's 300 and some million people in the United States, and they have different opinions. And a lot of what happens in the world is dependent on which things get into a government and the government takes action on. And within the Chinese Communist Party, there are very different views on what would be a good outcome. Do they want to live in a peaceful, balanced world, or do they really want to dominate? I am sure that there are some people in the United States government and the Chinese government who think the only way to go is to dominate others, and but I don't think that's the majority opinion.
Excellent. Well, it certainly will prove to be some interesting times because I know that China has been on President Trump's mind, both in terms of tariffs and in terms of that very competition that you're talking about, and perhaps who will win out in that struggle for domination versus coexistence, both in trade, cultural relationships. I didn't know that history about UW-Madison, and I fully agree with you that I think one of the best things the United States can do is invite more and more students to come here and study this kind of soft power so that they can expose our citizens to people from other cultures and people from other cultures to the US and the society that we have here. So I know we're right at 7:30. I want to be respectful of your time and everybody else's. And I want to thank you one more time, Professor Dennis, for joining us again this year, sharing your research and fascinating thoughts and insights into China. So we're very grateful for that.
Well, thank you, David. It's been a pleasure, and uh, I really appreciate that you invited me again this year. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And to all of our guests, I'll just remind you one more time, our next talk will be on Wednesday, March 5th in person at St. Norbert about artificial intelligence and American national security. So we hope to see you all then. Thanks very much, everybody, and have a great evening.
Bye bye.
Bye-bye.